All right, I'm going to get started. People will still trickle in, I'm sure, throughout the duration of the meeting. Also, just a reminder that this is being live streamed, so it will live online for the duration of a couple months or whatnot. So if you're not here right at the beginning, you'll catch it later. My name is Emily, and I am the ConnecTra Program Coordinator. Welcome to our Accessibility Community Forum on Accessible Education. First of all, I would like to acknowledge the importance of the land on which this online event is taking place. These are the traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples, and in particular, the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. This acknowledgement is a statement to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their history. Please join me in a brief moment of reflection. Thank you. So thank you for joining us and participating in this Accessibility Community Forum on Accessible Education, presented by the Disability Foundation and co-hosted by the ConnecTra Society. So as I said, my name is Emily. I am your ConnecTra Program Coordinator. The purpose of this forum is to gain insights and feedback from the community around accessible education in British Columbia. Here at ConnecTra, we value diverse opinions and perspectives. We want this to be a safe environment for everyone to share, so please be respectful of what others have to say. We're going to go over a few housekeeping rules. First and foremost, this forum is being recorded and streamed to Facebook and YouTube, so you may choose as a participant to have your camera on or off. All participants will be muted upon entry. To ask a question, type your question into the chat box or use the raise hand function under reactions in the bottom of your screen, and one of the volunteers will unmute you when Tony, our host, calls on you. Use the chat box for comments. If you require a screen reader, we recommend that you close the chat. We will be sending out a complete transcript of the chat after the event to all attendees, so you'll be able to catch up on everything there. We also have automatic closed captioning available. Please go to the bottom of the Zoom meeting, click live transcript, and then show subtitles to turn them on. Our agenda today is a brief welcome. We're going to do introductions of our fabulous panelists, and then we'll have a lively discussion for just over an hour and a half and our closing summaries. Now we're going to play a short video outlining some of the other programs and events that ConnecTra has.
ConnecTra creates opportunities for people living with disabilities by providing information, resources, and programming geared towards greater inclusion and quality of life. Check out some of the programs we offer through our online learning platform, Connect Together, including our Service Mondays, where we highlight a local organization or initiative, Wednesday Chair Yoga with Bobby Seal-Kobiski, Thursday Adapted Fitness with Megan Williamson, Friday Rotating Dance Classes hosted by Janice Lawrence and Joanne Cuff, and other initiatives including presentations by the Disabled Independent Gardeners Association's Growable program and our Perspective series.
Our next Accessible Community Forum is on accessible education. Be part of the conversation on November 18th from 1 to 3 p.m. as we discuss the current accessible education climate in BC. Register today at accessibleeducationacf.eventbrite.ca.
Check out our updated programs calendar on our website, connectra.org, or find us on Facebook at ConnecTra Society.
Also, we are having a ConnecTra Holiday Get-Together in-person event for free at the Creekside Community Center on December 6th. That's a Tuesday. It's going to happen from 5 to 7 p.m. There will be caroling. We're making centerpieces. It's going to be really wonderful, and I will put the registration link in the chat as well. All right, let's move on to our panelists. So I will do a quick introduction, and then I will let them introduce themselves to you all. So today's panel consists of Dr. Carly Christensen, an assistant professor at UBC. Carly identifies as a person with a disability who advocates for disability justice within schooling. Mike Prescott, who is the project manager for the Accessible Organizations Project at Disability Alliance BC and a postdoctoral fellow at UBC in Rehabilitation Sciences. Dr. Jennifer Fain, who is the Director of Education at LDS, the Learning Disability Society, PhD in Education, Social Policy, and Public Health, and is a BC certified teacher. Next, we have Frank Smith, who has been the National Coordinator for the National Educational Association of Disabled Students, also known as NEEDS, since 1986. Research access and accommodation issues he researches access and accommodation issues as they apply in Canada's colleges and universities. And last, we have Uli Edgar, who sits on the Accessible Standards Canada Technical Committee for a model standard of accessibility for the built environment and holds an RHFAC professional designation. So now I will let them introduce themselves and elaborate a little bit more. Let's begin with Dr. Carly Christensen. Welcome.
Hello, my name is Carly. I go by she, her pronouns. And as Emily explained, I am an assistant professor at University of British Columbia. My work looks a lot at supporting inclusive education. So this would be K-12 education systems mainly. I previously was a teacher in Ontario. I also taught in First Nations communities in Northern Ontario.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Next, Mike Prescott.
Hi, I'm Mike Prescott. As was mentioned, I'm the project manager for the Accessible Organizations Project, in which I'm working with over 800 organizations throughout BC, including school districts, independent schools, and post-secondary institutions to establish accessibility committees, develop accessibility plans, and create public feedback mechanisms. I am a manual wheelchair user with a far too many years of education. I'm in grade 29. I have a Bachelor of Science in Kinesiology from the University of Illinois, an MBA from Simon Fraser, an MA in Urban Planning from University of Waterloo, and a PhD in Rehabilitation Sciences from UBC. I've done postdocs in geomatics at Laval, and I'm currently a postdoc at UBC and working with SFU as well in rehab sciences and gerontology.
Fantastic. I want to know if grade 29 is like actually calculated out or just the bit that you say. Yes, grade 29. Wow, fantastic. Next, we have Dr. Jennifer Fain. You're muted. It was going to happen to one of us.
It was me, of course. Hello, everyone. I was going to say, I always said I made it to grade 26, so I understand how Mike calculates that. I started my career as a teacher in the New Westminster and Tri-City school districts and have worked with learners, diverse learners in the birth to 5 sector, elementary schools through to high schools, and have been in the post-secondary system for over 8 years as well, mostly working in teacher education. I currently am the Director of Education at the Learning Disabilities Society, or LDS. We're a Vancouver-based not-for-profit charity that serves over 400 learners a year in both academic, social skill, and early intervention programs. It's nice to join everyone here.
Thank you for being here. Frank Smith, would you like to go next?
Good afternoon. Thank you, Emily, and welcome everybody to this great event. As was mentioned earlier, I'm Frank Smith. I'm the National Coordinator of the National Educational Association of Disabled Students. And while I'm an old guy, I've been involved with the organization since 1986, as was also mentioned. We are primarily a youth-serving organization, and most of the folks who are on our board of directors, which represents the provinces across Canada, and also our staff and consultants are youth with disabilities. Are 90% of the people who are involved with the organization, and 100%, including myself, and 100% of our board are persons with disabilities. The board is made up of students and graduates with disabilities. So graduates with disabilities within 5 years of completing a college or university program. We are an independent organization and we're also a member group of the Council of Canadians with Disabilities. So we sit at the CCD National Council table with other national disability organizations and with provincial disability organizations across the country. The organization does research, we hold events, we have 4 fabulous websites, which I'll talk about later. That sounds confusing, but they each have a different purpose. We're all over social media. We offer a national, 2 national student awards programs that have provided hundreds of thousands of dollars to disabled students across Canada. And we are all about consumer focus to all of the work that we do. So the phrase that the Council of Canadians with Disabilities often uses is a voice of our own. We're very much plugged into that. So while we work with service providers and professionals and collaborate with them and advocate in the work that we do, we take it from a consumer directed approach. Most of the funding we get is through Employment and Social Development Canada, but we also have funding for our awards programs from private sector and from other through other entities. So it's great to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for all that you and Needs do. That's fantastic. And last but not least, Uli, if you could explain a bit about what you do.
You bet. Hi, everyone. My name is Uli Edgar, Accessibility Certification Specialist and Adjudicator for the Rick Hansen Foundation Accessibility Certification Program, with the mouthful that you had difficulty saying, RHFAC. So we have approximately 140 professionals across the country that rate sites for meaningful access, and that would include schools, high schools, elementary schools, colleges, universities, and other things like prisons, stadiums, you name it, we've rated it. So, and I have short gray hair and a beard. For those that can't see me, I'm currently wearing a white shirt and I identify as he, him. I met my wife, Kim, in 1985, and Kim sustained a cervical spinal cord injury. She's a quadriplegic in 1984, the year before. And we have been on this journey together since then. And it took us to the Rick Hansen Foundation about 5 years ago, and since its inception. And this has just been growing well. And we love to work with people in communities, etc. And hopefully we'll be able to help you out with some of your questions today. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you for describing all of that. I tripped myself up. I was like, Uli, Ula. Thank you for correcting me.
No worry.
All right, now I'd love to hand things over to our host. So please welcome our host, Tony Botello. He's the director of SFU's Career and Volunteer Services. And Tony has also worked in post-secondary disability support offices and moderated our Accessible Community Forum on Inclusive Employment last year. So welcome back, Tony.
All right. Thank you for that warm welcome, Emily. I just have to work out my throat issues. It's nice to be back at another Accessible Community Forum. And apologize there. And I'm also dealing with funny shadows. So I apologize for, if I come in and out for those who are needing to see me speak. So yeah, I think we can get right into it. We got a lot of questions. We have a fantastic panel. And so I was thinking we can just go straight to the questions. So let's do this. First one, Dr. Jennifer Fain, you are on. Education in BC includes birth to 5, elementary school, secondary school, universities, colleges, and trade schools. These various institutions cater to a wide range of ages, interests, and needs. So first off, if we can start by defining the different types of learning within these institutions, and you can also define the differences between homeschooling, distributive learning, brick and mortar schools, and home learning programs.
Perfect. Thank you, Tony. I'll try to get started. Maybe remind me if there's anything I forgot in there. For those of you that are joining interprovincially, or for those of you who are not overly familiar with the BC setting, that there's quite a lot going on there. The birth to 5 services, much like post-secondary services, are pay per use. So they're quite varied and include both public institutions, private institutions. And birth to 5, it is all pay per use, private, not-for-profit style service provision. When it comes to K to 12 schooling, we have a public system that goes throughout the province. There also are independent schools which receive provincial funding as well as parent tuition, parent or family tuition. And there also are some private schools as well, though they're smaller in number. When it comes to the K to 12 system, there are also multiple ways in which learners are engaging in the schooling system. So we have what are called brick and mortar schools, which are your neighborhood schools that you might wander around, walk down the block and physically see that students attend. School districts, the province of British Columbia is broken into school districts. There's about 80 of them throughout the province. Many of them also offer different models. So they might offer a home learners program, which is a program that students might attend a few hours a week or a couple hours a day in a school-like environment, but then do the rest of their learning independently at home. Then there's also distributed learning models, which may be through a school district, which would be a fully online program that students can access from home, or there might be some contact hours in a schooling environment as well as an at-home, in an at-home environment as well. COVID has really increased the amount of ways in which people are able to access K to 12 schooling in a variety of ways. So more options between hybrid models, essentially between in-person and online service provision. There are also a range of distributed learning schools that exist only in the internet, essentially, that learners from across BC can enroll in without worries about catchment. So that's sort of probably a big high level overview of the complexity of public education, public and private education in BC. Don't know if it'd be helpful, Tony, to drill down in any specific areas.
Well, I think for now, that's great. I think that set us up in terms of a nice context. So I think that was the key here. And I think some of the questions as we move forward, we're going to have the opportunity to go a little bit deeper, but thank you for that fantastic getting us off the ground. In this case, we're just going to open it up to the entire panel. To just get your perspectives on, what do you see as some of the major differences between the private and public sector when it comes to meeting students' accessibility needs? And let's see, who wants to go first with this one? Uli, I saw your mouth, but I wasn't sure if you were.
You know what? I have to put 25 cents in the jar.
Yeah.
I'm good to go with that. So I'm going to do a bit of a spiel here. And it's about where we were 35 years ago and where we are now. So when Kim went to university 35 years ago, it was not easy, for sure. The campus Kim attended, and it's a campus here in Vancouver, was not built with her in mind. Her classmates literally had to carry her up the stairs to get to her classes, or she had to take freight elevators, or she had to take ramps if there was a ramp even available. Libraries utilized microfiche, which is far beyond a lot of people's memory, but there were no computers and you had to ask for help every time you turned around. There was nothing that was accessible for people that had low vision, were blind, people that were deaf or hard of hearing, and also people with mobility disability. There's all sorts of challenges that happened in there. And I'd like to talk about signage and wayfinding. So approximately, I rated approximately 100 schools, and that's university campuses, college, trades, elementary, high school, private, public, you name it. The biggest thing that was missing, in my opinion, was wayfinding and signage. And I can remember being a young kid going to high school for my very first day, and I had a high degree of anxiety as a child. And going to that first day of school and not knowing where to go and how to get there was the part that was the most bothersome for me. And it took me a long time to sort of come to grips with learning where things were in the school. I was hard of hearing. I am hard of hearing. And that was not accommodated in my day at school at all. There was no consideration for people that were hard of hearing. And to this day, when you look at a classroom and you look for meaningful access for children, is that classroom easy to get into? Does that classroom make you a spectacle when you go into the classroom? Or do you go in there and flow in with the other children and enjoy your class as all the other students do? And or if you're a teacher with a disability that needs to go into the classroom. And I would say the biggest thing that I noticed in all of those schools, there was 99% of them did not have any technologies for hearing, none. And there was one school out of 100 that had it. So that's not a very good rate. So that and illumination, being able to see clearly in a class and be able to see the board. Nowadays it's whiteboards, not chalkboards. That's really important. And I just always like to remember where I was as a child and where children are today. And we're encompassing more children into schools these days. I see talk in the background and chat about neurodiverse, etc. That's really important. And we have to learn how to accommodate all people. Thank you.
No, thank you for that. And thank you for that, that historical context, both in, remembering, how things were not that long ago. And also the things that can be improved. I thought I made a note about signage, which is, again, back to a fairly straightforward, low cost thing that could be done that could have quite a tremendous impact. Just wondering if anyone else on the panel has anything else they would like to add on this, or we can move to another. Jen.
Yeah, just going to the question about accessibility in terms of private versus public systems. In the K-12 schooling system, you're not going to see generally a significant, in my experience, and I work very closely with 400 learners across probably about 60 school districts. We won't see a huge difference between the level of support across independent schools or public schools, because it's ministry funding that ostensibly provides that provision. Unfortunately, in BC, what is called high incidence disabilities, which are more common disabilities like learning disabilities, behavioral challenges, these high incidence, because they're common, the province actually does not give the student funding. There's no child or learner specific funding that comes through for common disabilities, high incidence disabilities. There is some funding, individual funding for low incidence disabilities, so less common, such as ASD, severe behavior, physical health challenges. But the funding model, which is very flawed, because, I strongly believe that all individuals with disabilities deserve supports, is the same in both public and independent schools. There are some private schools that are extremely well resourced because parent tuition is extraordinarily high, and there might be a difference in those schools. But then again, that's really a family resource capacity versus actually a systems capacity. So generally, you're not going to see, again, in my experience, a significant difference between what students actually can receive in an independent versus a public school, unless parent fees are very, very high. When it comes to post-secondary, you will generally, in my experience, see better accommodations and supports in public post-secondaries versus private providers in post-secondary. So there's a bit of a more significant difference there. In birth to 5, generally you'll see the most comprehensive supports and training in not-for-profit organizations or organizations connected to universities, medical centers, like, again, ones that have strong board oversight. Private providers there's not as much supports for private providers, even though there's licensing. But again, you'll see the biggest difference there between not-for-profit and private providers in that sector.
Yeah, oh, wonderful. And thank you for tying in that thread of the private and public, and also just, illuminating, some of the similarities or where there's the fee structure, because I know there's often discussion about, a certain type of school being better or not. And I think the importance is, we have to look at the individual institution and sometimes context. So that's fantastic. And yeah, thanks for that. We're going to keep moving on. And since Uli got us on the topic of accommodations, we're going to keep going on that thread. A third of survey respondents do not know how to request accommodations for their needs within the educational system in BC. So Frank, where can people get this information? And what is the best way to go about requesting accommodation? And as you're responding, I want Mike to start thinking about maybe some of your own experience on this to add to what Frank might have to say. So Frank, if you can start us off.
Sorry, could you repeat the question, Tony, again, please?
Sure. And I will, and I'll try to do it more articulately.
No,
Since,
I just wasn't listening carefully enough, really. Okay, go ahead.
Not a problem. It's basically on the idea that a third of survey respondents report to not knowing how to request accommodation from their educational institution.
Right.
So the idea is, where can they get the information on where to go and how to do this? What's your insights given your experience with needs?
Right. Okay, well, I mean, I think that there are a number of considerations. The first one, of course, for every student, for a student leaving high school to go to college or university, the number one decision should be made around academic choice. So the field of study that the student wants to go into or is passionate about, that should be the first consideration. And then, of course, finding universities or colleges that have that program, whether it's journalism or engineering or medicine, whatever the case may be, right? Recognizing there may be undergraduate study to get to certain professional programs. So there's maybe a path that has to be followed with respect to that. And then in terms of, so the individual is the student or person first who's got ambitions with respect to post-secondary education and ambitions with respect to a career path, right? So there's that to begin with. That's the number one consideration. And then there's the issue around access to financial assistance to go to college, university. So that's, an understanding of provincial and federal funding programs, the Canada Student Financial Assistance Program, or in BC, you get a combination of a federal grant or loan, and you get funding from BC Student Aid. Typically, if you're a resident of the province, and then there's the issue, of course, of so there's having adequate funding to go to school, and each student is in different sort of circumstances when it comes to their through their family circumstances and everything. And some students will require more funding than other students, and also some educational paths, depending on the number of years you're going to be studying in your program, may be more expensive than others. We also recognize, of course, that depending on a student's disability, it may take longer to complete a program of study, which can add to costs that relate to tuition and living costs and all those kinds of things. When it comes to accessible education and accommodations in university or college to ensure that the student has equal access and is studying on a level playing field with their peers, there are lots of considerations there. Of course, it has to do with the individual, and it has to do with the individual's disability and how they experience that in a learning environment. And we recognize, of course, that there are lots of students who have all, across disability types, who don't require any accommodations or don't believe that they do. And sometimes if there are accommodations that are required, then the student will typically register with accessibility services or disability services on campus, become familiar as well, of course, with supports and services that are available, including peer support services that are available through student unions and student governments. There are many on-campus disabled students groups that can provide that sort of peer support, often supported through student unions. The one thing I think, picking up on what Uli said earlier about the difference between the 1980s and today, and I can certainly reflect upon that given my post-secondary education and my career path and working in this field for our organization. Certainly a lot has changed. Mostly it has to do with technology, and it has to do with our understanding of universal design. And we've had a lot of advancements in technology that have leveled the playing field and provided opportunities for disabled students that weren't there before. But one thing that remains the case, unfortunately, in a lot of ways, is that the model of service provision and accommodations is still very much medical model in that you have to provide documentation to prove your disability to get the services that you need. If you need extra time or if you need adaptive technology or whatever the case may be. There's also documentation required with respect to your financial assistance and the level that you get in terms of grants. So, for example, for the services and equipment grant from the Canada Student Financial Assistance Program, you know, there are requirements that and documentation required. And we know that many students with disabilities are reluctant to provide certain documentation and feel they don't need to provide it as well, right? And up until now, of course, there have been students with various kinds of episodic disabilities, mental health conditions, et cetera, which are not sort of easily diagnosable in some cases, that have been left out of the equation and have not been properly accommodated. I'll just mention one more thing with respect to this, is that on the financial aid front, one positive change in the last few months is that the Canada Student Financial Assistance Program has changed its definition of disability for eligibility for the disability-specific features of the program from permanent disability to include persistent and prolonged, which will mean, according to the federal government, they believe another 40,000 students who have disabilities that would be, classified as persistent and prolonged, which may be permanent, will be eligible for financial aid. So, I'll just leave off with one more thing. If students are looking to access information on accessibility services, financial aid, you name it, we have a lot of information available and resources available through our websites, including disabilityawards.ca, which is totally devoted to financial assistance specific information.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Frank. That was great. And Carly, you got your hand up. I'm gonna let you add some stuff here.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Frank. One of the things that continues to be a persistent issue in the transition from secondary school into post-secondary is this medical model and the need for all these documents. And so one thing that can happen to students as they leave their high school setting is that they could need another assessment, because sometimes to access student accessibility centers at their university, the tests need to be within a certain range of years. And that adult assessment then needs to happen. And due to COVID and various other issues, the wait lists to get these assessments through their university and college can be years. And that could mean years of no documentation in post-secondary education, which translates to years of no accommodations that are your legal right to have. And so this is a persistent problem. And the other thing along with this is, due to various issues, for example, the lack of culturally responsive assessment, the lack of the gender disparities in diagnoses of various disabilities. For example, female presenting students with ADHD often go undiagnosed through like formative school years. They could end up in post-secondary and not have a diagnosis yet. And so this also creates these long wait lists in the Student Accessibility Center, which further causes another disparity. So some university and college students then end up having to pay out of pocket for these assessments to be able to get their accommodations. So that's what I have to say about the post-secondary transition. But then if you are a K through 12 student and accessing accommodations, well, there's still a medical model predominant in most provinces. There are some provinces that have moved more to a needs-based model of providing service provisions for diverse students, but you still will be required to go through a process. It will, for example, to create an IEP, an individual education plan, that should include accommodations listed, but it also should include the student's strengths. We're hoping to move more towards a strength-based, or in BC, a competency-based individual education plan. So that's a positive move in education. But those IEP documents, they need to be in deep consultation with parents, caregivers, the child themselves. And when that happens, that's the space that you as people with disabilities and parents, caregivers can say the following things I need in a school setting to learn, to be socially included and academically included in my classroom. But as we also know, there are barriers in that process, but that is the legally mandated process. So as parents and people with disabilities, students with disabilities in K through 12, you can, that's formally where your voice is supposed to be heard.
Wonderful. Thank you for that thorough and very rich addition to that to the conversation. And Jen has her hand up, so you get the floor now.
Just because this is a common question I often get about parents, families of children wanting IEPs in the K-12 system in BC. And unfortunately, a school is not legally required in British Columbia to write an IEP for a student unless they have a ministry designation. Which doesn't mean they won't. There are schools that write IEPs anyways without this, which is another level of disparity because sometimes this is seen between schools and school districts. But schools do not legally have to provide an IEP unless there's a ministry designation, and a ministry designation often doesn't happen without lengthy documentation and often a psychoeducational assessment. Psychoeducational assessments are very difficult to access in BC. Out of pocket, they're between $200 to $3,500. School districts only have budget to put a handful of students through these assessments per year. So, and often it's students with the most significant behavioral challenges that get the assessments versus students who are otherwise quiet, well-behaved students in the classroom who really do need them due to learning differences, ADHD, autism, all other types of diagnoses. So that, just in case anyone is kind of wondering what it actually looks like on the ground, often in terms of IEP provision, there's a lot of inequities, and it can be very challenging for parents and families to move their child through that process due to a lack of resourcing.
Yeah. Okay. Wonderful. Thanks for that added clarity. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to, because I had Mike in the batter's box for a while here. I wanted to get your perspective, professionally, and also from your 29 grades of school that you want to add, and then we'll go to Uli right after.
Well, from my perspective, the challenges that I've seen are really about the ecosystem of accessibility. So when you sort of put things into silos of issues, it really misses how the sort of like the network of experiences happen. So like in my research, even though it's more on mobility in the public space, in an outdoor space, I'm interested in how that, journey modeling, how you go through education. And so you can have your physical space at your school that's perfectly accessible. Well, that's never going to happen, but how are you getting to school? And then other issues once you're at school, the things like the IEPs and stuff like that. And one of the things that I found in my research is, and it was sort of alluded to, is around sort of this episodic element, but the temporary barriers that come up that people have difficulties navigating. And so if you're not experienced in the area of in disability or accessibility, then you're really having to think on your feet or in your chair about how to deal with that. And it's not like historically we've had this idea of promoting independence and those aspects to be able to address those kind of challenges. So I'm really, whenever I think about accessibility and inclusion and engagement, it's what does that whole network, how do all those links coming into play, and not thinking of it simply as, everything has to be perfect. It's really about how can we do the best job with the resources we have to a certain degree. I mean, yes, we have standards that we want to achieve, but we have to understand there are going to be limitations. And if you don't understand how everything's connected, then you're not necessarily going to use, have ROI, your bang for your buck. So one example, this is purely a physical world kind of thing, is at University of Waterloo, one of the buildings they wanted to improve access to is that they spent a lot of money on the washroom and a ramp into the building and everything. I don't know, $40,000-$60,000, whatever it is. However, to get to the ramp, you had to go up a 10% hill. So, this new building really, and the ramp and everything, did great job for the guys delivering the beer because it was a graduate pub kind of thing. So, and it's just, indicative of how thinking about how those interconnections happen. And if you miss it, because having a disability is really, there's a requirement for a seamless experience, whether it's education or anything, I think. And when you have a break in that chain, it really makes it close to impossible in many situations to move forward. So I'd like to see these education systems really model things out from the different perspectives, whether it's the teachers, the students, administrators, and stuff like that, and really find the levers in there that will make the experience as a student or that much better.
Yeah, great points. And I love this sort of bringing in the systems perspective, because things are interconnected. Very few things happen in isolation. And the interconnection is not just it's complex. The nature of interconnection is complex because of all the different influences and ways things influence each other and then are influenced by the things that they've just influenced. We're going to go, I believe, Uli, then Frank.
Things I noticed rating schools is that some were better than others. And this brought me to a point that I think Jen brought this up the other day when we all met, is that we're restricted by catchment. So perhaps that needs to be looked at as a betterment for students that would do better at this school rather than that school. And not because of the teaching that's available. The teachers are all great. But the actual built environment that they need to get into, and whether there are quiet rooms for people, whether there are good accessible washrooms, depending on the child's needs, etc. So, and Carly, you touched on this as well, was age and sometimes taking longer to complete something, whether it's in college or university. And my view, also in elementary and high school, some students take longer to complete their first segment of school. And are we looking at that as well? There's that magic number of 18 that kids are kind of taken out of the system. And that can be present a lot of difficulties for parents and for children. So looking at your model, Carly, that you're talking about, that sometimes it takes longer to achieve, whether it's high school graduation or it's a university degree that takes you 7 years to complete rather than 4 years to complete. That's a really good point of view. So I'm going to just leave that open on the floor for Jen and Carly if you want to comment on that. But the catchment area, I think, is an important one to move children into a better environment for them, not for the school district.
All right, no, thank you. Great points. And Jen, Carly, anything to add on that? It looks like Carly. Yeah.
Yeah, so this issue of catchment is quite interesting. So the thing is that if we like accessible schools, to me, also includes being inclusive schools. And in this mission for inclusive education, children should have the right to attend their neighborhood school, where their siblings, if they have them, would be, where their peers would be. And so when we know that one school is physically more accessible, or maybe in other ways more accessible, like teaching strategies employed, the amount of universal design that the school is doing in their classrooms, for example, like that's actually a problem in my mind, because what we're then saying is, why is a student with a disability being discriminated against in their catchment area that now they have to attend a different school? And so one thing I teach my BEd students, so my students that are becoming teachers here at UBC, is it is not actually legal to tell a parent of a child with a disability in a public school that they can't attend this school, that they have to go to a different school. And the reason why is because the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in Canada says that you can't discriminate based on ability. And so the real question here is, to me, if it was any other minority group, would we be able to say, you can't come to this school, but you can go to another school, not with your peers, not with your neighbors, in a different area, and we could have to bus you, or you have to figure out a way to get there. That would be seen as extremely wrong, and it should be in this case too.
Yes.
This has been tested in various provinces legally, and it has been said, like in Manitoba, for example, you can't do that. And so here in BC, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms still stands. You can't discriminate you can't discriminate kids based on their disability. But on top of that, we also have the BC School Act. And in the BC School Act, it says the only way you can deny entry to a school to school for a student in your district is based on numbers. And so it doesn't have an asterisk that says, unless they have these physical needs, unless they need the following nursing needs, there's no asterisk. And so to me, that is also signaling, I hear a lot of stories, and in my research, I've come across a lot of people's lived experiences where they have been told to attend a different school.
Yep.
And so this is really problematic, and we need to do better and have all the schools be at the same level of accessibility for our kids, because they have that right.
I agree with that. I was speaking more to choice. For some parents might want to choose, or a child might want to choose a different school that they would like to go to. Me growing up in East Vancouver, I probably would have chosen a different high school could I have gone to a different high school, and but I wasn't offered that choice. So
yeah,
that's where I'm coming from. I'm not disagreeing with you at all. I believe that all schools should be universally accessible for everyone.
Yes, I agree. I wasn't assuming that you disagreed, though. I was more meaning that when we talk catchment, this is how I see it play out, is that instead of focusing on like parent choice, we focus on school districts being able to move people instead.
Yep.
Which is the problem.
No, wonderful discussion. I love it. And this is really coming on one question. And Frank, you started it. We're going to let you wrap up this question.
You're on mute, Frank.
I started it there, therefore I shall finish it. I guess to follow up on what Tony just said, or the line of reasoning there. I think that, well, certainly, it's clear we're talking about different levels of education, right? And I think that in elementary school, in particular, we know that students, kids, children, whether they have a disability or not, are for a number of years of their lives not in a position where they're the primary decision makers. So their parents are making decisions for them, and their teachers, and and professional people and school boards and things like that, right, are making decisions on behalf of the student, which can become particularly problematic when you have lots of, in elementary and even secondary schools, there are lots of issues around physical accessibility that, of course, sadly filter a lot of students out, or limit the choices that are available to them and to their parents at a critical time in their development, when all schools should be available to them, all schools should be accessible. And then, these things are less of an issue when you move into public post-secondary. Somebody mentioned earlier that private career colleges, for example, are terrible for accessibility and for student services, let alone disability services. Public post-secondary, sure, there are lots of universities that are older, with lots of older buildings that can pose issues around physical accessibility, but it's more of an effort and a concentration of provincial dollars, et cetera, that ensure that the public post-secondary experience is more likely to be student-centered and accessible and available to more students than at the lower levels of or the early stages of one's educational development. But I think that we need to sort of reconfigure the way we look at now I'm thinking about the post-secondary context, we need to reconfigure the way we think about persons with disabilities in higher education, for example, and what accommodations or services are available. So I think we need to get away from, and we still have this problematic medical model, which triggers the services if the documentation is provided. But we need to get away from this notion of disability accommodations, thinking of it as something that's exceptional or perhaps burdensome on the institution or on the people who are teaching or providing services. It's not at all. It shouldn't be considered that way at all. All Canadians deserve the full access to education at all levels, including college and university education. And what's provided in a post-secondary context, whether it relates to the academic experience in the classroom, the learning experience, or the campus life experience, interacting with other people in the campus community, or the physical accessibility of universities and colleges in those physical spaces, we should be thinking about human accommodations, not disability accommodations. In other words, we are all different. All people are individuals. Disability is only one part of somebody's identity. We think about gender, race, ethnicity, gender identity, sexual orientation. From that intersectional lens, and considering that students with disabilities are students like any other student. There may be some different learning styles or approaches. There may be some physical access issues that are dealt with by some students and not by others. But any accommodations that are provided in the post-secondary space, whether in academic life or campus life or in physical spaces, should be considered to be part of the human experience. So human accommodations, and if you don't have two people who don't have disabilities or aren't aware that they have a disability, for example, or disabilities, will be individuals, and they will learn differently. They will experience life differently. So disability is only one part of the human experience. So we have to get away from this notion of thinking that these are disability accommodations, that it's a special or exceptional thing that's being done to support students who are somehow extraordinarily different from the rest of the student population. No, they're part of the student population, and that's the way we need to look at it, that everybody needs to be fully included. And people with disabilities are brilliant, they're passionate, they're in many ways, because of the disability experience, disabled persons are more creative. They're in their thinking. They're more. I hate to use the word. I know some people in our community hate this word, but more resilient. I think it's fair to say, right? So that can mean that the disabled student, even if the learning approaches and certain accommodations might be different from a peer who doesn't have a disability, that student might actually be a lot more creative in their approach to their academic experience, might be a lot more creative and passionate and have extraordinary abilities that actually extend from the disability experience they have as human beings. So I think we need to consider that. I know that, like, back in the mid-'80s when our organization started, and I think it was Uli and a couple of other people were talking about, how far we've come over the years. Certainly it was more black and white in terms of, here, and also we had much more segregated education system. And there was still some aspects of segregation within the disability experience too. There's less of that now, but we still have this medical model. And the thing that bothers me is, do we, for example, if somebody has a physical disability, does a service provider or a faculty member need to know that the medical definition of that disability is spina bifida or cerebral palsy or whatever the case may be? That doesn't matter. It's just that it's how does that student get around? How do they move through life and through campus experience? They happen to use a wheelchair. They happen to require certain human accommodations because of who they are. The medical stuff is not so important, and in a lot of ways it's nobody's business, right? So we've seen in some cases we've actually seen human rights complaints that have been filed, like they were with the case of one student at York University in Ontario who objected to the fact that she was being asked to provide documentation. She has mental health conditions, was being asked to provide specific documentation on the various types of mental illness that she had and that once she was on certain medication and stuff like that. That doesn't matter. I mean, that sort of stuff, it becomes at a certain point invasive of one's privacy and unnecessary to the provision of accessible learning and experiences and an accessible inclusive education.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for that, Frank. And I like some, thinking back on the human aspect of this and the individuals and make the institutions, such like the one where I work at SFU, what are we doing for, we want it to be a positive experience for all and taking some of that. So I did see, Uli, you put your hand up. We have quite a few questions coming from the audience. So do you have a quick addition do you want to add?
Well, I'll try to be as quick as I can about it. Looking at any type of school situation and accommodating students, we should be looking at universal design for all students, not just a person with a mobility disability. There's many other disabilities that we seem to focus mostly on mobility, and that is because code was kind of based on mobility, and it is the main focus of code over the years. However, now we are moving on to everyone. We're talking about all people these days, and that's super important. When I grew up, I went to elementary school in the 60s, so I'm the old guy here, one of the old guys here, and there was no integrated school in those days. We were segregated, so children that had disability never went to school with me, and I never saw a child with a disability until I was in high school, and so things have changed for the better in a big way. People are becoming everybody's becoming part of society, which is just super important. People of all intellectual levels and people of all ability are becoming part of society. So that's I took that away from Frank. Frank, thanks for bringing that up. That was a really great segment that you put on the table here. Thank you.
Yeah. Yes, thank you, and thanks for. I love the way everyone's filling in everyone's comments as well. It's making a much richer discussion. Well, on this theme, we've had Sam from the audience has passed on a question, and he says, in my experience at a public post-secondary institution, the disability center staff are so overwhelmed that they actively work to create barriers for students to access disability centers and accommodation because they can't handle the number of students otherwise. And they admit this openly. Anyone, any comments or reactions to that?
It's certainly, unfortunately, it is an absolute reality that access units, disability services at most post-secondary institutions are overwhelmed by the number of students that they're trying to serve. That is true. One of the other big challenges too that comes is as students matriculate from high school into post-secondary or re-enter post-secondary after taking a break, often they don't know the timelines, the requests that need to go in, and they also maybe don't know the documentation and what they actually need in order to work with the disability services unit or access unit. So often there is a significant bottleneck that happens, especially September to October, as students are realizing they have to book appointments. The appointments appointments are full, they have to get their documentation, all these things are going through. So I think it's absolutely, like, I absolutely would like to acknowledge Sam's experience here, that is undeniably true. I also personally had quite a few issues in my role as director of education at LDS in trying to support our learners that are accessing public institutions about some of the requirements for documentation, which I think are actually really regressive and not helpful. For example, we have learners here with a diagnosed learning disability that is a lifelong disability. Nothing can ever possibly change. A person will have a learning disability forever. Yet, as Carly said, they're required to have a psychoeducational assessment within 5 years. Why? That makes zero sense. That is a permanent, persistent disability that will follow that person forever. Their accommodation requests are generally pretty easily facilitated like at the university level. It's often requests for more time, different excess material, like recorded lectures, like they're honestly easily done. But this idea, you need a $3,500 assessment to do a 5-day assessment, again, that you already did to evidence that you still have a permanent learning disability, is really challenging. And a lot of that comes, like, why post-secondary institutions often stick to those things is because what's in ministry guidelines. They don't have to, but they'll choose to toe the line and hold those ministry guidelines. So I have had some luck with engaging with access units at some institutions and getting some individual exceptions for students. Unfortunately, the squeaky wheels do get the grease, and advocacy can be really powerful. But I systemically am struggling to deal sometimes with access units with rules that really don't make any sense for students. So positively somewhat is that if there is funding for adults in post-secondary with disabilities to do those assessments, that it does exist. There's also funding for academic support as well if you have the documentation as a person with a disability. So learning to play the system is going to be probably your best bet, but I do want to acknowledge it's not fair, and the systems don't work that well currently in any level right now.
Yeah. Thank you for that insight. And so, yeah, and just even the question around, if something doesn't change, why do we need this updated? Some of these processes and systems just become institutionalized. And the question, why do we need that? I think, Carly, you had your hand.
Yeah, thank you, Jen. And thank you, Sam, for your question. Before I worked at UBC, I was a high school teacher, and I did a lot of transition planning. So most provinces in their suggested policy for an IEP, once you're in high school, 14 years old, they're supposed to include a transition plan that helps you with that transition from high school to whatever you're doing after. Now, obviously, as Jen pointed out, there could be a gap, like where you take a break or you work for a while and then come back to post-secondary. But if you are planning to go from high school into post-secondary, your team, your school-based team in high school is supposed to be helping you make those initial contacts with the Student Accessibility Center. They are supposed to be helping you reach out and find out what documentation are they requiring, what could we do right now that would still be valid by the time you get there, for example. And one thing that, just a short anecdotal story, one of my former students, we were in one of these meetings. He was already accepted to university. We were processing some of the paperwork. He has autism spectrum disorder. And then the Student Accessibility Center at his Ontario University gave like a list of the things that they were anticipating he would need as accommodations. And it was very classic things like extended time, maybe a due date extensions, things like that. And then he looked at the list and he basically stood up and said, oh, well, I can go home now. And we're like, oh, do you want to end the meeting? And he was like, well, it looks like when I turn 18 and go to university, I don't have autism anymore. Because all of the accommodations that he'd had in high school, there were so many that we'd seen that worked, and he wasn't seeing those on the university accommodation sheet. And so, yes, we need them to go to the Accessibility Center, and we do want them to get the documentation, but then what is offered is often less than what they experienced and the support levels they experienced in high school. And transition planning only works if all of those people are there and the school is actually doing the transition plan and having the parents there and having the student there too. So another sort of issue in that whole system that we've been talking about.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, just again, the issue of system seems to be coming up over and over again in terms of the, the interconnectedness, or when it's not as connected as we, it should be or could be. So thank you. And we have another audience question from Tara. And it says, on this topic of autism spectrum disorder, they wrote, I do a ton of reading on ASD, and there isn't much for accessibility for autistic adults in any form of education or support systems across Canada. This issue is systemic across Canada, and the older one is, the less support there is. How has BC addressed this issue? So, anyone on our panel want to start on this one?
I can at least maybe jump in, just because we do LDS do serve autistic adults who are looking for supports for both transition into the workforce or workforce transition, or also transition back into university college. Absolutely right. There is very little out there, and what is out there is usually for vocational training or workforce training, or trying to get individuals back into the workforce. So I'm not sure exactly sort of the full realm. Like, I don't know if the question was also about like social programs, social services, civic engagement, like beyond education and or training. But if someone is looking specifically for supports for workforce transition or academic transition for autistic adults, absolutely feel free to get in contact with LDS. We can absolutely support with that. For life skills and social skills, I think autism spectrum disorder is quite challenging for programming for adults, just because the diversity of the way that ASD presents, and a lot of the supports are for autistic adults who have very high support needs, who would need support with assisted living or other like sort of day-to-day assistance. I think unfortunately the autistic adults that probably receive zero support are those that can easily mask, or who have such late diagnoses that they miss sort of opportunities to be connected in with community and support. And I think that is a huge blind spot. BC is trying to work towards more of a needs-based model, as Carly mentioned. So they're hoping to replace current ASD funding model with a hub-based models. This is all sort of like happening right now. There's not been a lot of information shared about what that looks like, what's covered. A big blind spot for the families that I work with is that ASD, for example, has autism has all the funding essentially, but ADHD has zero funding. And if you actually look at an individual with ASD versus an individual with ADHD, just those diagnoses don't actually tell you anything about the needs of the individual and what supports they actually need. So I think we really need to work to a needs-based model that is not, like, again, against that medical model, about a needs base. So like, what does this individual need? Let's get them what they need, versus this diagnosis means you need this, and this diagnosis means you don't need anything, which clearly is inaccurate. So yeah, I'll let someone else kind of take it from there.
If I might, the path of education, as you mentioned, is to get employment. And there are a lot of barriers to employment for people, whether it's ASD, whether it's being neurodiverse, whether it's having a physical disability or being blind or deaf. There are many barriers. So there's a lot of basics that need to be in place for people, starting in the school system. And I'm going to just touch on a few of them. Is all gendered washrooms that are universal washrooms to accommodate students that may not be comfortable going into a multi-stall washroom. Children that might need an adult change table or an overhead lift to help them make it through their day, so they don't have to go home and miss a whole day of school, and possibly, when they become an adult, a whole day of work, maybe just missing an hour of work instead of the whole day. So I like to look at those things. And my friend Marinka, who I've known since she was born, she's now 30 years old. She's an adult. She does not comprehend written words. She never has. When she was born, they said that she would never walk or run or talk. She does all of those things. and but she cannot understand written words. So having things like pictograms helps her get through life. She got lost at Vancouver Airport on her own. She was at an Olympic event, and thankfully was able to find her way to her group by using pictograms. So having things that are outside of the scope of what we normally think of what we need in education, a lot of those are barriers, just basic barriers for meaningful access for everyone. And I've got all sorts of things written down here, but I'm going to try to keep it short here. So it's just about breaking down those barriers, no matter who the student is or who the child is or who the adult is, that we can accommodate them better. So a lot of people might need a quiet area in an office. They might need a room to just go sit by themselves for a while. So are employers recognizing this? Probably not. Are schools recognizing this? Somewhat. It's getting better. But that aspect of getting employed is really, really important for all people. It's meaningful to have a great job. Like me, I love my job. Best thing that's ever happened to me. But that's not the case for everyone. Not everybody has that same opportunity of finding something that's very meaningful for them. So we need to guide them on that path and give them all the resources that we can to get them there so that they have that meaningful position in life, whatever it might be.
Exactly. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. And the range and the idea that also can shift and change. What's meaningful for someone at one point might change as they move on through their lives as well. I understand that Tara, who initiated the question, had some comments. And so I believe we're going to try and unmute Tara. And
hi, everyone. I grew up in an era of BC, Northern Vancouver Island, when supports were very few and far between, and the special needs classes back then were very segregated and they didn't really optimize the abilities of a disabled person growing up. So I know what that era is very much like, okay? I went to Cole Harbour School of Special Needs, to give you a basic idea. Now, as I got older, up until about 14, I lived in BC and various parts of BC, and BC had very little accommodation for invisible disabilities. And even though I had a learning disability, we didn't know what it was until I was 39. Now, as I aged years, I moved to Alberta, where at 39 years old, I finally got diagnosed with autism and ADHD while attending a school called Norquest College. I believe some of you saw my comments in there, but Norquest College being very discriminatory and very bully-like when it came to disabilities, especially those with invisible disabilities like my own. This is still happening to a lot of students across Canada, and I feel that as I age, the less I have, especially the fact that I have no supports when it comes to family because my family is too old or too sick or too far away. I have my husband, but he too is undiagnosed autistic. So we got two autistics in this household that when they retire are going to need help when they age, but are independent. There is nothing for people that are, well, in the upper echelons, unless if you are below 30 and a tech-savvy autistic, for which I fit neither area, but my husband does, but he's an older autistic that's a computer whiz, and I hand my computer to my husband all the time saying, honey, fix. How is BC going to fix this? If disability is for life, then should we not address this issue?
thank you for that. Tara, is anyone on our panel who wants to start on this?
I'd just like to really thank Tara for her contribution, and absolutely, I think everyone on this panel would absolutely agree that it's unacceptable, the level of supports for adults with disabilities, especially those who are able to live independently and do just well enough that essentially they're not captured by other social services as a catch-all, and it's not good enough. It's not okay. you know, we've seen significant cuts to social health education funding over increasingly regressive governments in BC over the past 20, 30 years. And this is what cuts look like. This is what happens when you continually cut education and health spending budgets. So my organization, we do a lot of advocacy in this area, and we are trying to push. But again, like, we need people to get out there and vote for change and actually make meaningful change. And anyone who says that we don't need to do this in this area, like, I wouldn't even know what to say to them, because there are tens of thousands of British Columbians suffering without the supports that they need to thrive. And just doing okay enough is not good enough. It's not the life that's acceptable for Canadians. So I just thank you for sharing, Tara. And again, I hope people continue to pick up the torch and make a meaningful difference in the way that they vote and the way they advocate, and how we talk about the need for better services for British Columbians.
Yeah. Thank you, Tara. Yeah, for raising that. And it looks like we have a few more, like Frank, then Carly, to add to your thoughts as well.
Yeah, thank you, Tara, for that question. I think that I know that Uli was talking about we need all individuals, and particularly people with disabilities, to be able to follow the path that they want to pursue and get into the career that they want to pursue, and to live a productive and hopefully fulfilling, and also the kind of life that will afford them what everybody in this country is entitled to. The fact of the matter is, though, that we and this affects folks with disabilities at all levels, but including students who are in post-secondary and those who graduated from post-secondary education, or those who have no post-secondary education but are adults with disabilities who are just sort of struggling, is we have in this country, we have support systems that are inadequate, right? So, we have, for example, disability benefits programs that are different from one province to another. They're all inadequate. They're usually, depending on the province and the provincial government, they may be a little bit more, a little bit better from one province to another. In Ontario, our office is at Carleton University, so we're in Ottawa, and in Ontario, we are a national organization. But if I think of the Ontario context, we have a conservative government in Ontario, in the Ford government, which is, and I don't want to get too much into politics here, but of course is really regressive and bad for people with disabilities and all people who are often living below the margins. We have in this province, the Ontario Disability Support Program provides like $1,200 a month or something for an individual, and that's well below the poverty line. Most recently, there was a 5% increase announced, and also there's been an increase announced on the income threshold. It used to be $500 you could make and receive your benefits without clawbacks. Now it's $1,000 in Ontario. But still, we know that many people with disabilities who are reliant on disability benefits, including while they're students and youth in school, are stuck in this situation where if you graduate, if you're in school in a province like Ontario, you can receive, and you're receiving disability benefits. If you're amongst the folks who are receiving disability benefits, you can get a summer job, for example, and you can work 8 weeks or 10 weeks and not have that impact your ODSP payments. As soon as you graduate from college, university, and if you still need to be on Ontario disability supports, then you get the $1,200 a month, and you have this income threshold, which was $500, now it's $1,000. So what happens is a lot of people who are highly qualified, have post-secondary education, have ambitions when it comes to their careers, are reluctant to lose their vital benefits that they need, for drugs or for medications for technology, adaptive technologies, mobility devices, whatever, and are stuck in this situation where they're either unemployed or underemployed. We now have in this country, of course, we're getting close to having a Canada disability benefit. That's a federal benefit. We don't know what that's going to look like exactly, who's going to qualify, how much it's going to be. But, the two concerns are is how much will it be? Three concerns. How much will it be? Who will qualify? And will the provincial governments just take money away that the federal governments provide to persons with disabilities, right? So we have this spiraling sort of circling situation of poverty. At the same time, on the positive side, there's an increasing number of persons with disabilities going into post-secondary education, an increasing percentage of folks who are graduating with degrees and diplomas and expertise in many fields. I think the situation is starting to get a little bit better, and there are opportunities. We have legislation, including provincial disability legislation in BC, started in Ontario with the AODA, and in other provinces. And we have enabling human rights legislation like the Accessible Canada Act and the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So sadly, of course, we need to have, and it's important in a country like Canada, which considers itself progressive, we need to have the levers of human rights legislation to ensure that in education and employment and in daily life, that the rights of persons with disabilities are being respected, and that the discrimination is being addressed. But it's often people are voiceless because they're so entrenched in their own poverty or own lack of supports and services in community.
Yeah, and no, thanks for raising that. And I think we may be coming back to the issues around finances and poverty later on. And I also thanks for raising the callback disincentive for work, which is a really frustrating one, I know, for myself and many others, particularly as I've moved in the career space, knowing how important experience is, both for the experience, for the relationships, for opening up other possibilities. And if there's disincentives for people to try things, even for shorter periods or whatever it might be, the downstream effects could be quite devastating. Carly, did you have your hand up on that one?
Well, Frank did an excellent job. He mentioned all the points I wanted to mention. I have one thing that I have been trying to teach a lot more to my teacher candidates is about ableism and the language of ableism, and that this should be being taught as part of the social justice movement in our K through 12 schools, straight up into university, because when we name something and call it what it is, it brings power. And so, Tara, thank you so much for sharing your lived experience. And those are examples of severe ableism. And we have ableism that can, just like racism, it can interact in all these complex ways, in subtle ways, in hidden ways, in systemic in nature, cultural ways. And what we're talking about with all of the poverty, and I know we're going to get to another question about that later, but those are examples of systemic ableism. And we need to talk about it, and we need our society to gain a greater understanding of this. We need our teachers in our schools to understand that when they limit the abilities of kids with disabilities, that's ableist. When they assume less competency, that is ableist. When they plan for the average student instead of who is in front of them, that is ableist. And that is a type of discrimination. And it violates things like the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the CRPD. And if we're really going to move towards the Accessible Canada Act by 2040, that means calling out ableism, including it when we talk about social justice. That is the I in EDI. So when we say equity, diversity, and inclusion, when we're not doing that, those are ableist discriminations.
Thanks for that, Carly. And yeah, I think it's a perfect segue. We might be coming right back to you in terms of a question that came up earlier. And basically, from the survey response, indicated that many have experienced or felt some sort of discrimination based on their disability in their academic experience in BC. Respondents indicated that teachers and support staff were only adequately trained to support students with physical disabilities. The lack of training extends to students with physical, intellectual, and learning disability as well as those who are neurodiverse. Can you talk about the type of training? You've made some mention to that. You have the class. It's now part of the curriculum. Yeah, a little bit more about, is this mandatory? Is it enough? Is it ever enough?
Yeah. Okay. So no, it's not enough, in my opinion. And I think of, when I think about inclusion and where we need to get to and where we are, it can become quite daunting. But I have really appreciated other members of this panel that have brought up where we've come from. And that encourages me to hope for a future that is more accessible and inclusive to our students. One of the barriers, however, in the literature around more inclusive schools, I'm talking specifically K-12 schools, is teacher-based attitudes. So it's not just the training that they need to have about kids with disabilities, but it's also overcoming that systemic discrimination that is embedded in all of our social systems, that has discriminated and continues to discriminate disproportionately towards people with disabilities. So we have to do the unlearning and have them see students with disabilities as capable people that add to the diversity of their classroom, that have multidimensional identities. And someone in the panel, I think it was Frank maybe, talked about this earlier, intersectional identities. They're not a kid with a disability and that's it. They're also they also could have a racial identity, a religious identity, a gender identity, etc. And so it's seeing that complexity. And so in our classes at UBC, there is a required course to become a BCTF, so a BC certified teacher, that is on the inclusion of students with exceptionalities, is what it's called in the class, into the general classroom. And they are required to take that class. Now, the step forward in teacher education, what the literature is telling us is that it can't just be one class. It needs to be embedded throughout the entire program, every teacher ed program. So if you are becoming a teacher and you're in a class about literacy and how you teach reading, are we talking about the 16 to 20% of students with disabilities and how they are going to learn how to read? And so, yes, I love teaching this class, but I want that content not just in my class, I want it in every class. And when they're in practicum, where they go work in a classroom with a supervising teacher, are we talking about disability? Are they seeing systems that are functioning in the way the BC government wants them to work? Are they pointing out to our teacher candidates, this is an IEP, this is how it's used? So those are some of the barriers in teacher education. And then I can't mention this part enough. Teachers that were trained 20 years ago, they didn't have even the class that I'm teaching. And so then we also have this thing where as the system changed, we put out new teachers that have more training than the ones before. But what do we do about the teachers already in the field that didn't even have the opportunity necessarily to have had that training? And so this is where professional development comes in. And there are a lot of school districts who hire wonderful people that go in and talk about inclusion, that train teachers in the field right now. But that can be quite haphazard with which districts are focusing on this, which teachers get to come. Do all the subject area teachers do this Pro D? What about the support staff? And so this is where that gap in the time of the system, it can almost feel frozen in time. And so my hope is that there'll be more districts that will put inclusion and training teachers that did not have this chance and the teachers that did to further embed that practice. And that's where I hope we're going.
Yeah, thank you for that. And that's, yeah, I love that direction. And I know also the challenge of it's not just who we're training, but there's a system that's been in place for decades and people who've been in and educating as well as shifting culture is can be really challenging. So thanks for your perspective. We're going to go Uli, then Jen.
I liked Tara's comment about inclusion and who's hiring. So a lot of times when people with disability, and it depends on what type of disability they have, they're often sent into organizations that are disability oriented. So that's where their area of employment opportunity is, rather than a broad spectrum of employment opportunity. And I can remember people that had graduated from UBC many years ago, and their only option was to go work for a nonprofit disability-oriented organization because nobody else would hire them. They just could not get a job. And the other opportunity sometimes is government. Government is pretty good at hiring people with disability across a broad spectrum, but even that is pretty low in my opinion. So I really like what you had to say, Tara. And Carly, thank you. That was really informative. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for that. And Jen.
Yeah, it's probably slightly out of sequence now, but I just wanted to pick up on some of what Carly was saying about teacher education. One of the biggest challenges, teacher education in BC is offered by about 4 or 5 institutions, and most of the programs are between 1 year to 2 years that sit on top of a bachelor degree. So it's actually a very short period of time, teacher education, where say a year or 16 months, where you're trying to transition students between classroom-based learning and school-based learning and back and forth and trying to build these competencies. And there definitely is a recognition at all of those institutions that special education or supporting students with disabilities is very important. There's also really other extremely important competing areas as well, such as in Indigenous education, indigenizing the curriculum, as well as the SOGI curriculum, sexual orientation, gender identity. So teacher candidates right now are trying to grapple with a large amount of social change in the areas of accessibility and disability, of indigeneity, as well as stigmatization of people of diverse gender and sexual orientations. And it's very challenging to equip people with the critical thinking skills to engage with all of those topics and then apply them at the same time within 16 months, while they're actually trying to also learn the other types of things they need to learn on the job as new teachers, such as classroom management strategies, how to design and integrate curriculum, how to be a professional in a school environment. So it is actually very tricky. I've been in teacher education for 10 years, and I'm sure Carly would say the same thing. It's very hard to do this work meaningfully with students who are often very focused on, but what do I need in the classroom? I need to get my lesson plans, I need to get my curriculum plans, I need to go out there, I need to do good work. And then they're also facing schools that are under-resourced, under-equipped, and teachers who, quite frankly, often don't know what a strength-based IEP might look like, or what accommodations look like, or what a differentiation of curriculum look like. So I'm also very hopeful, because I've worked with hundreds of teacher candidates and on placement, and there are more than 100, many, and I see lots of change and lots of great things happening, but it will take decades to really systemically change the schooling system, because we have teachers who've been teaching in schools for 40 years who, when they did teacher education, those types of students, people with disabilities, were not in classrooms. They never once received training on it. They did not work with those students. And now they're expected to do that without the training and support staff that they need. So I am optimistic about where we're going. I see people doing this work. I'm so thankful for experts like Carly, who are teaching these courses and doing them well, but it will take time. It will absolutely take time to get there.
Oops. Yeah, so good point there. And Mike, got your hand up, would add something on there.
Well, actually, it's a question based on what we were just talking about in both areas, and in terms of one area I think that's missing, and I'm not in education myself, but about hiring people with disabilities and trying to encourage more people with disabilities to get into the education tracks as well. I think that way you can jumpstart some of those issues. And I'm not sure where you, in your experience, sorry. My question was about whether or not the hiring of people with disabilities so that into those positions so that you can jumpstart accessibility question. How is that being addressed?
Frank, you have your hand up. Is that related to if that? I'll let you go. Frank, then Carly.
Yes. So this is sort of picking up on what Jen and Mike just said. That I think it's really important that that people with disabilities are reflected across society in all different types of organizations and in all different fields, right? And clearly with higher education and training, there are highly skilled individuals with disabilities who are graduating and are able to move into teaching positions, are able to move into, positions that are available in government departments and crown corporations and private sector industries, etc. It is only when the profile may be the wrong word. It's only when the composition of the organization is fully representative of people with disabilities. And when I say that, thinking about it in an intersectional way, that change happens, right? So even in my own orbit, I'm hearing from people that are not really particularly close to me, but I know them, sometimes family and people who are I have associated with over the years, who are getting to the point where they're ready to retire and they're saying, thank God I'm retiring now because I can't handle all this diversity and inclusion, this woke agenda. I hear from people, even people I know, and it makes me so bad. And the good riddance to those people. They really need to retire, because it is only that, the change will only happen if an organization has, if you have no black and racialized people in your organization, how are you going to understand what it means, what that experience is like, and how you can be more accommodating as an employer, or as a high school or an elementary school or whatever, right? I mean, you need to have your organization needs to be reflective and representative of the community, and that of course includes persons with disabilities. So the thinking will change and the approaches will change based on the composition of the organization. I had an interview with actually a journalist in BC a couple of weeks ago, who reached out to me and said, "Can you talk to me about all gendered washrooms?" I think somebody else on the panel mentioned all gender washrooms. I can't remember who that was. Really did. Okay, that's great. And it's really interesting. 2 weeks before I had this interview, and I'm not an expert in all gendered washrooms. I'm not an expert on accessibility, like accessible design and things like that either. But 2 weeks before this student reached out to me, I was at the university, at Carleton University, where our office is. And I went to the coffee shop on the 4th floor of the university center, and the all gendered washroom had just been completed. They renovated it slowly. They renovated 2 washrooms by Rooster's Coffee House. One was male, one was female, and they turned it into this one big space that's an all gender washroom. And I used it for the first time like 2 weeks ago, and I was so impressed with the facility. And I'd been in all gender washrooms before, but I thought it was great that this was finally happening in the hub of Carleton University, in the Unit Center, where the student union is. So you would expect that progressive things like that would happen. And then I took a picture. There was a sign outside the washroom that explained, and I don't have the sign in front of me right now, so I can't show it to you, that explained what the benefits of the all gender washroom was and how it was inclusive and supportive of everyone. And that includes, of course, people who identify differently when it comes to their gender. It includes people with disabilities. It includes parents with children and all of these things. So 2 weeks later, I had this interview with this journalist in BC, and I emailed her the photo that I'd taken with my cell phone outside this all-gendered washroom. And here's an example of inclusive design, of an inclusive space, of universal design. In other words, thinking about what is it about this place that will serve the most people, right? And it's good for everybody. That doesn't mean, depending on the building and depending on the space, there might still be a requirement for a single occupant washroom, but maybe take the nameplate off that says male or female and just say, don't just put washroom, or a priority to persons with disabilities or something like that. So there's an example right there of something that the thinking behind that and the reason for doing it, the push came from, in many cases, from people from the trans community, from people who didn't feel comfortable using regular men only or women only washrooms. And there was pushback on the right from conservative people who were saying how terrible it was and everything that couldn't be done, right? And then we find out when we do it that it's better for everybody. And then getting back to the point about accessibility services staff being overwhelmed. So I think that is very true, and we're hearing that from students all the time. And oftentimes they have to wait a couple of weeks to get an appointment, or there's a backlog to be registered to use the office in the first place. And we have a lot of appreciation for people who work in that area. Many of them are really dedicated, and they listen to what students request in terms of accommodations and respect what they need. And they try to offer services that are respectful of the student voice and the student experience. But the other aspect of that is thinking about, okay, there was a time that the thinking was, oh, you have a disability, you should go to accessibility services. We can't support you here in this particular office, so you have to go over there, right? There's constantly pushing students off to say, this is your designated space. Well, hopefully to take a little bit of pressure off accessibility services, recognizing there will still be a requirement for some level of expertise and specialized supports or whatever, equipment and all those things, but that every single office at a university or college campus, every single lecture hall, every single teaching staff member should be, I won't use the word trained. They should have the capacity, and often that is just like human empathy and understanding and listening to the students. They should have the capacity to provide whatever support those students need as a human accommodation, as human beings who learn differently and maybe have different requirements, but all have the right to use that to access the learning, access the spaces, all of those things, right? So I think that the sort of the all-gendered washroom is a perfect example of something that people thought years ago was impossible, and it was just this, left-wing notion by certain people, is dangerous, whatever. No, it's better. It's better for everybody. Get over it. And we can find a way of doing it. But sometimes it's the people who need those spaces who have to push to make other people who are naturally resistant to make it happen.
Right. Thank you. Yeah, and wonderful example.
Well said.
And I've already noticed that it's 2:45. We're in our home stretch. Carly, do you have some comments you'd like to add on that as we're getting ready for wrap up?
Yeah, I'll be really quick. So there has been some research done about teachers with disabilities in schools. And I totally liked what Frank was talking about needing to diversify our actual working staff and what do schools look like? Who is getting to teach? our future students. And also, what materials are we using to teach? So for example, do we have books that represent people with disabilities? Do we have content about people with disabilities when we talk about historical movements, or when we do a novel study in a class? Like, people with disabilities, we've existed forever. This has been part of the human experience. And so when you're teaching a history class, is that in it? When you read a children's book to your grade 2 class, do you have any that represent people with disabilities? But then also, who are these teachers? And we obviously, as universities, are trying to become more equitable in who we have and recruit for our teacher education programs. And the experiences of people with disabilities in teacher education, that is a new space of being researched and seeing how they experience that. But as a person with a disability myself that was a teacher, I can say from my own lived experience that schools were not always the most inclusive place to work. And I had a principal once that said, like, how are we going to become an inclusive place for kids with disabilities when we can't make it inclusive for Carly to be a teacher in this school? And so that speaks volumes for what Frank was just saying about the need for people with disabilities in these workplaces. And so I think that is a shout out to school districts and teacher education programs to really consider what that would look like.
Yeah. Thank you. That's wonderful. And I did want to check in with Mike on here, because one of the questions I've been thinking, and it's been is this idea that you've worked, and actually, given your grade 29, which is still one of my favorite concepts, you've actually participated in school systems in different provinces. And I wonder if you could just talk about what some of the things you've witnessed or experienced in the different contexts, undergrad, graduate level, BC, Ontario, and any other place you may have been at from a personal perspective.
I would say there are not really a lot of great differences. It's more maybe over time. It's really dependent on if you have got the right champions within your organization. I think that's makes a big difference. But I think a lot of the things that everybody's been talking about is still in an evolutionary process, and doesn't necessarily trickle down, to use a really bad term, to everything else that might be within that education system, whether it's post-secondary or secondary, et cetera. And again, I think it kind of goes back to having more representation, considering accessibility of the physical environment, social environment, how you bring parents into the conversation. So it's been very different. I went to University of Illinois, where it's basically the origin of accessibility and disability sport. So it's where wheelchair basketball started, and I went there on a wheelchair basketball scholarship. So very different than anything in Canada. There's no thought there, even recreation programs, for instance. I've yet to see any of those opportunities. Like, I always think, why am I putting any money into the recreation group when they don't offer me any opportunities? It's kind of different. It can really depend. Whereas Douglas College, for instance, provides great, and that's because they had a champion who happened to be the women's national team coach, wheelchair basketball team coach. So it can be a lot based on who's in the system and whether or not they're thinking, again, systemically about how accessibility and inclusion is incorporated in how they deliver their services.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, it is interesting. Yeah, it's always, the people in certain contexts or certain environments, how that can shift things, or what the institution wants to offer. Jen, do you have a quick point? Because we're hitting to final statement time.
I know. I just really quick, just because see a lot of the comments in the chat around autistic individuals and maybe a lack of inclusion. So I just wanted to say that I am very proud that I have several neurodivergent educators on staff and instructors, autistic instructors, because I think it is very important that we do have autistic educators, neurodivergent educators working with all children, but also, of course, specifically with neurodivergent children, because if you do not see yourself reflected in teaching and education, you are not likely to become a teacher and educator, and then we can never actually redress the exclusion of people with visible and invisible disabilities in education. So there certainly are autistic educators, neurodivergent educators, just like there are LGBTIQ2+ educators, but they may or may not even feel comfortable being open about their neurodivergence in education settings due to worry about perception or pushback and all these types of things as well. So I think there are autistic neurodivergent educators with disabilities out there that may not necessarily, people might not be aware, they might not feel comfortable, and or they might have been excluded. So I think employers, schools, education systems have a big really need to, as Carly said, make them actually inclusive, not just for students, but for educators and teachers and students to see themselves reflected in education. And I think that we're making progress, but we're still a long way away from redressing that exclusion.
Yeah, no, excellent points. Yes, some progress, a lot still to be done. We're almost at time, we're at wrap up. And the conversation's been so rich that we've actually had trouble getting to some of these questions. I think we need to have a part 2 and 3, I'm assuming, but there has been, as Sam had put up an earlier question, and so maybe if someone might be able to give a quick response. Is it standard practice that post-secondary students are unable to access accommodations that cost money unless they apply for a student loan? And just so we can think of that question, if anyone has a direct answer to that, but then also thinking that in general, and this is maybe for our final comment, there was a lot of concerns or issues around the state of financial assistance for individuals with disabilities to be able to afford education. So maybe as people think their final comment, I want to think about cost and being able to afford, but on the very specific question, is it standard practice that post-secondary students require or need to apply for student loan to access accommodations? Does anyone have a specific insight? Anyone? Jen? Jen, then Frank.
Yeah, my understanding is that there are grants available for students with disabilities to access funds for assistive technologies or other support, such as specialized tutoring assessments. My understanding is that you need to apply for those grant funds to be able to receive the grant funds and use them, but I'm not aware that one has to have a student loan in order to be eligible. I do actually have questions about eligibility and whether one needs to be eligible for student loans to access those grants, though, because sometimes there are income means. So some students who come from wealthy families, for example, aren't eligible for student loans necessarily. There could be hangups, which might mean that there likely might be challenges in accessing funds for, say, psychoeducational assessments. So I think there is a lack of need for clarity in that space, because I have learners struggling to move through those systems and access that funding really effectively. But that's not my understanding. And if that is the case, then that would be a significant equity issue. Yeah.
Perfect. And Frank, if something to add quickly? Oh, you're on mute.
I think I did the opposite. I thought I wasn't muted. Anyway, on the subject of financial assistance, one of the things that we're trying to do as an organization, by creating the website disabilityawards.ca, we're trying to put in one place information on federal, provincial, and territorial financial aid, along with funding that's available from non-governmental organizations, including and also private sector funders in some cases, and that includes our organization for the awards programs that we run. The other thing about our disabilityawards.ca website is it actually has scholarships, awards, and bursaries that are offered to disabled students through individual schools across the country, over 200 post-secondary schools. So oftentimes, for example, there will be like memorial scholarships are created. For example, when somebody passes away, there's a scholarship that's created to provide funding to disabled students or students with a certain type of disability in somebody's memory. And that scholarship may be $2,000 or $5,000 a year. And it may be to a number of different students, but sometimes there may be hundreds and hundreds of these scholarships within a college or university that students aren't even aware of. unless they do a lot of their own digging. So this is one of the things we tried to do with our disabilitywars.ca website. And that, of course, includes information on federal programs like the Canada Student Financial Assistance Program. Most students receive a combination of federal and provincial grants and loans. And oftentimes, because the loans or the financial aid is integrated, they're not exactly sure what the portion of funding is from each. But for example, to Jen's point, there is the services and equipment grant that disabled students can access if they have exceptional, I shouldn't use the exceptional, higher costs for equipment or for tutors or interpreters or whatever than other students would have. I think that's up to $20,000 a year. And the thing that I think is really encouraging, even though there's too little, but the levels of funding is still too low to support many students adequately through their post-secondary studies. But there has been a shift over the last 20 or 30 years within financial aid programs to offer more grants than loans. For the proportion of grants to loans to shift, it used to be called, the federal program used to be called the Canada Student Loans Program.
Mm-hmm.
Within the last year, they changed the name of it to the Canada Student Financial Assistance Program with good reason, because the proportion of grants to loans has shifted. And that's a very good thing. And during the pandemic, the upfront grants for students in post-secondary studies, including students with disabilities, were doubled. And our organization, along with the Canadian Federation of Students and other student organizations, we're encouraging the federal government to keep the upfront grants at the same level, the doubling that happened a couple of years ago, because that additional funding was not only needed during the pandemic, during those extraordinary circumstances that all of us found ourselves in, and students experienced great hardship, but it continues and it continues to be an issue as folks move forward. So the financial aid piece is critical. And I will say too that with our own funding programs, we noticed the accessibility resilience program we created during the pandemic has been run for 2 years now to support unmet costs and needs to hundreds of disabled students with funding through the federal government Employment and Social Development Canada Supports for Student Learning Program. When students filled out their applications for this additional funding, and they could get up to $5,000 from our awards program, we found, students were reporting to us in the application system that they had inadequate technology. And when I say that, we even had some students who said that they were using their cell phones to do their schoolwork because they couldn't afford to buy a laptop, right? So we still hear stories like that, and those are not isolated. And oftentimes we've got students who are living in families where there are, in lower sort of socioeconomic circumstances that put them at a disadvantage to begin with. So the parents can't afford to buy their son or daughter a laptop if they can't get funding through financial aid programs to support that cost. So we still have, things are getting better, but we still have a lot of work to do and a lot of advocacy to improve financial aid programs.
All right, and thank you with Frank, and rounding us up on some of the financial issues. And it's been wonderful. And now I'm going to pass it back to Emily to help with our closing.
Yeah, 3 o'clock on the dot. Thank you so much, Tony. You did such a wonderful job at moderating the conversation. Yes, Melissa put in the chat, it was very informative. I learned a ton. Thank you to our panelists, Carly, Mike, Jen, Frank, Uli. Thank you so much. We learned so much, and we could do a part 2, part 3 on all this. They always whip by. So I just want to let everyone know in attendance that a transcript of the chat box, as well as the actual Zoom meeting, will be edited and just cleaned up for spelling and whatnot, and then sent out to all attendees. We will also pull resources that were mentioned from that chat and make sure we have all the links to them, and that will be added to our resource page on our website. So we'll have an education tab for that. And yeah, I hope that you will come in and join us in our other programming at connectra.org/events. Come to the holiday party, December 6th. And yeah, really appreciate these conversations. They're among some of my favorite programming that we have here at the Disability Foundation. We do also send all of that information to a list that we have put together of people in the education sector in BC that can instigate real change. So it comes along with a lot of city officials, government officials, and we will be sending out all of our survey findings and information from this chat along to them. So as Frank said, things are improving, but we still have a long way to go. And I hope that you being a part of this conversation and feeling like you were heard and learned something contributes to that. So thank you so much. Happy Friday, everyone.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for being here. Wonderful. Rebecca, you can end the live stream.